Iraq. I'm sure many of you automatically associate this word, this name, with a destroyed country that's ravaged by war. A place with no hope or future. A place where religious extremism runs wild and there are endless conflicts between Sunnis and Shiites. And you know what? You'd be absolutely right. This has been Iraq's reality for the last few decades, especially following the first Gulf War, the US invasion, and the emergence of the Islamic State, the terrorist group which ended up occupying a large part of the country. We're talking about a place that is a factory for bad news. Without delving too deep, in the last few months, strong social revolts have caused a lot of tension. The Iraqis are unhappy, and for good reason.
Iraq. At least 42 dead and 2,000 injured in anti-government protests. Iraq protests. Capital Baghdad blocked as unrest escalates.
However, this time we're not going to talk about a destroyed Iraq, or disasters, or about victims, or indeed about misfortune. If you're a regular viewer of this channel, you've probably realized by now that we like to look at the bright side of things too, and it's precisely in this video right here on VisualPolitik that we're going to try and show the side that no one ever talks about when it comes to Iraq, and that's its good side. But does this country really have an upside? What would you think if I told you that even though this country still has loads of problems and is light years away from being a good place to live, there are still plenty of reasons to be optimistic? Well, listen up. It's time to look at some history. After all, we cannot understand today's Iraq without taking a look at their past, at least the country's more recent past. In 2003, after Saddam Hussein and his regime fell following the US invasion, a state of chaos and a lack of institutionality emerged that continues to this day. After the US occupation, an interim government was established for a year, and then a transitional government was in charge between May 2005 and May 2006. It was this transitional government that drafted the current constitution. However, despite all these attempts for political normalization, the country's governance was virtually impossible. And it was precisely in this highly conflictive environment, with institutions that were unable to function and a complete lack of safety, that jihadist militias increased their influence and power. That is how extremism boomed, which resulted in numerous attacks that, of course, caused huge amounts of damage and greatly fueled the anti-Western sentiment amongst a good part of the population. Of course, the United States and its allies hadn't only occupied the country, they were unable to bring order to it and had turned the Iraqi city streets into hornets' nests. That's why the people who perceived international troops negatively were no longer just the supporters of Saddam Hussein's regime, but were a much wider range of people. And it was precisely this rejection of the West which grew slowly and explains news stories like this one.
Iraq. Anti-US cleric Muqtada al-Sadr's bloc confirmed as election winners.
So, is Iraq at risk of becoming a new Iran? Well, let's not get ahead of ourselves, and let's go back to 2014. That year, an Iraqi man, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, leader of the Islamic State jihadist group, declared his own caliphate, a world caliphate, on Iraqi lands. He came to be considered a successor of Muhammad, and his call mobilized vast numbers of militants. The restoration of the caliphate led to the beginning of a huge military offensive by ISIS, where heinous crimes were committed while capturing huge amounts of land. Even important Iraqi cities like Mosul or Fallujah fell under their power, and with that, the most recent reign of terror had been created. And we all know this story, especially now that the United States has confirmed that it has eliminated Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi.
He died like a dog. He died like a coward.
The fact is that since 2014, the defeat of ISIS became the #1 priority of both the Iraqi government, as Iraq was held against the ropes due to ISIS's advance, and also the United States government, as well as, of course, the Kurds, who we discussed in depth in a recent video. And of course, faced with this challenge, all of the Iraqi government's efforts were focused on defeating the Islamic State. Everything else just drifted into the background. As you can imagine, this meant Iraq's social and economic advances were paralyzed for a very long time. Who would dare to invest in a shattered country that was also being invaded by ISIS barbarians? The worst part is that despite all their efforts and help from the West, the threat of ISIS still hasn't disappeared, even though the caliphate has been dismantled.
ISIS is regaining strength in Iraq and Syria.
But hold on just a second. At the beginning of this video, we did promise that we weren't going to talk about the bad side of Iraq. In fact, we said we were going to talk about the opposite. And it's hard to find positive things in a place like Iraq, but believe me, there are some. The fact is that after the caliphate's fall, Iraqi institutions have been strengthened and security has greatly improved. This has made Iraq begin to take a few steps forward.
Changes arrive. Better late than never.
I don't think anyone would doubt the difficulty of rebuilding a country that has practically been at war since 1980. That's almost 40 years. It's a situation that not only didn't improve with the US invasion, but actually got worse. After the occupation and the violence that broke out, Baghdad became a city divided by large walls, military controls, and roadblocks everywhere. Mobility in the city was very, very difficult. To give you an idea, it took hours to cross the city by car because of the huge number of detours and controls that you had to cross. The city looked more like a gigantic military base than a country's capital. Citizens lived a virtually kidnapped existence. Curfews were common, and it wasn't even safe to go outside for tea or coffee. Baghdad condemned you to a terrible life, and in many cases, a pretty short one. However, after the defeat of the Islamic State Caliphate in Iraq, things have begun to improve by leaps and bounds. Check this out. To turn the situation around, one of the key measures that the Iraqi government has implemented has been the plan to eliminate all military checkpoints, obstacles, and interior walls that separated neighborhoods from each other. After 15 years of living with these elements, Baghdad's population has experienced worrying social changes, mostly a result of isolation. The isolation of the neighborhoods created closed communities which barely had contact with other communities within the city. This led to an increase in violence and rejection among the different groups once access was restored. And to combat this, the first step to take is evidence.
Iraq lifts nearly 30 kilometers of blast walls from Baghdad. Official. Iraq plans to remove 300 checkpoints, erect security fence in Baghdad. Quote, more than 600 streets will be opened up in Baghdad, and all concrete blocks will be removed from streets in order to ease traffic jam, end quote.
Imagine how it would have been to live in Baghdad in the last decade. It would have been a true nightmare. But the changes don't just end with the capital. So what's happening in other parts of Iraq? Is it as significant as they say?
Emerging from between two opposite poles?
Even though it may be hard to believe, there is more good news on the horizon for Iraq. It looks like things are starting to function again. Public works have increased, housing construction is at its highest level in recent decades, and crude oil production is skyrocketing.
Iraq's oil production has nearly doubled over the past decade.
According to OPEC, crude oil exports have grown to around 3.8 million barrels per day, allowing Iraq to make almost $70 billion in 2018.
Iraq is pumping record oil, creating a fully blown migraine for OPEC's cutting plans.
The problem stems from the fact that the relationship between the central government and the semi-autonomous region of Iraqi Kurdistan, which also happens to be where a large part of the deposits can be found, is frankly rather bad. And in fact, one of the reasons for this tension is oil. In Iraq, oil exports depend heavily on the Kurdish region. The central government and the Kurds share oil revenues, and sometimes this ends up serving as a political weapon for each side in order for them to put pressure on each other. But this isn't the main reason for their bad relationship. The real trigger was the Iraqi Kurdistan independence referendum, which we discussed previously right here on this channel. Without a doubt, one of the things that has aroused the most fears and misgivings in investors and the international community has been the relationship between Baghdad and Tehran. So yes, in Washington they must be pulling their hair out. You invade a country, you spend a fortune, you have a lot of casualties, and in the end that country ends up in the hands of one of your greatest enemies. It's all pretty crazy.
Iran-backed militias are here to stay. Iran dominates Iraq after U.S., quote, handed the country over, end quote.
So that's how it is. Although, to be fair, we should state that Iran's influence seems to have lost a bit of steam in recent years. This may be due to, among other things, enormous pressure from Saudi Arabia. But even so, we're talking about a relationship that puts many political leaders around the world, especially in Washington, on edge. You see, a union comprised of these two countries, Iran and Iraq, joined together would lead to an alliance that would have combined reserves of more than 300 billion easy-to-exploit oil barrels. This would be the largest conventional oil reserve in the world. It's more than the reserves of Saudi Arabia or Venezuela. We're talking about an alliance that, with 120 million inhabitants and such natural resources, could easily become the greatest power in the Middle East. What's more, we're talking about two Shiite majority countries, two of the three Shiite majorities in the world. The other one is Azerbaijan. And don't think I need to remind you that in that area of the world, religious ties are extremely important. Well, the fact is that in modern-day Iraq, there are at least 30 armed groups, most of them Iran supporters, who make up the so-called Popular Mobilization Forces. These paramilitary forces have no less than 125,000 troops. 125,000 troops over which Tehran holds very important influence. And this is something that the Iraqi government itself has tried to curb, but in all honesty, they haven't really been very successful. First, the armed groups were invited to leave their loyalty to Iran in order to join the Iraqi armed forces, and now they're trying to do it by force, which is putting the country on alert again. Getting rid of one, only to get saddled with another, some countries just seem doomed.
Death tolls soar as pro-Iran militias accused of shooting protesters.
Now, it's precisely due to this wave of violence that the Iraqi government is now trying to put more distance between themselves and the Iranian regime and to look more towards Riyadh instead. That is the Iraqi government's new strategy. And for once, we aren't talking about military issues.
Saudi Arabia makes inroads in Iraq to curb Iranian influence.
The state-owned oil company, Aramco, the chemical company, Saudi Basic Industries, and the mining company Ma'aden are just a few of the big Saudi corporations that are looking to set up in Iraq by establishing joint ventures or making direct and indirect investments in Iraqi companies. Moreover, Saudi Arabia opens another consulate in Baghdad at the beginning of April 2019, accompanied by an aid package worth $1 billion. And that's not all, because at the end of October 2019, King Salman and Iraqi Prime Minister Mahdi met in Saudi Arabia and signed at least 13 agreements related to trade, energy, and political cooperation. Yes, it looks like the Iraqi government wants to take advantage of the Arab Cold War to get their share and flood the country with dollars. It makes sense, wouldn't you think? Now, will the Popular Mobilization Forces allow this, or will they once again unleash a campaign of violence and terror to destabilize the country for another decade? And will Iraq finally succeed and take the leap towards stability and development? Well, we hope so. So I really hope you enjoyed this video. Please do hit that like button if you did, and don't forget to subscribe for brand new videos. And please do check out our friends at the Reconsider Media podcast who provided the vocals in this episode that were not mine. Also, this channel is possible because of Patreon and our patrons on that platform. Please do consider joining them and supporting our mission of providing independent political coverage. And as always, I'll see you next time.